Trauma-Sensitive Theology, Thinking Theologically in the Era of Trauma. Reflection Lab Presentation by CHRISTIANAH Coleman. Perspectives on Culture and Theology in Trauma, Grief and Loss. Kairos University, Spring 2025. Professor Dr. Rosemary B. About the author, Jennifer Baldwin. She is a reverend, a theologian, therapist, and trainer, a mental health clinician. She specializes in trauma recovery, PTSD, vocational discernment, and school success. She also specializes in anxiety, depression, self-injury, and identity exploration. She provides trainings for clergy and spiritual care professionals in trauma-sensitive theology and religious leadership. She uses contemporary traumatology, somatic, and internal family systems, IFS model of psychotherapy. She is a survivor of trauma. Intentions. The intention of this book is to 1. Fill the gap between needs of trauma survivors and the knowledge available to those offering all forms of pastoral and theological care. 2. Help theologians, professors, clergy, spiritual caregivers, and therapists speak well of God and faith without further wounding survivors of trauma. And 3. Explores the nature of traumatic exposure, response, processing, and recovery, and its impact on constructive theology and pastoral leadership and care. Core concepts. Writing from the standpoint of professionalism and experience, the author posits that 1. The 21st century is rife with trauma. 2. Faith does not exclude one from or prevent post-traumatic responses. 3. Church can be a place of harm as well as a place of support and health. 4. Communities of faith are never perfect. Many had been traumatized by the destructive dimensions of congregational life in church leadership. And 5. Pastoral and theological training do not provide adequate education on trauma and traumatology. And 6. Clergy sincerely desire to provide supportive, stabilizing, grace-filled presence to persons and communities impacted by trauma. 7. That care of traumatic wounding must include all dimensions of the human person, including our spiritual practice, religious rituals, and community participation and theological thinking. 8. That clergy and spiritual care professionals have an important role to play in the recovery of traumatic wounding and fostering of resiliency. 9. The language we use in discussing traumatizing experience and in post-traumatic response is very important. Language we use can exaggerate, minimize, or accurately reflect what occurred. 10. This book explores how trauma-informed congregational leaders can facilitate resiliency and offers one way of thinking theologically in response to traumatizing abuses of relational power and our resources for restoration. This book is in two parts: Seeing Trauma and Constructing Trauma-Sensitive Theology. Each part has 4 chapters each. Author concluded the book by inviting cohesion. Part 1, Seeing Trauma. The author in Part 1, Seeing Trauma, identified what trauma is and what trauma is not. She also analyzed the types of trauma. Trauma is wounding. It is an injury that, like most other injuries to the body, is not automatically or necessarily terminal or debilitating. Trauma is not ontology. Traumatic wounding is not a final word. Types of trauma include primary traumatization, secondary traumatization, intergenerational traumatization, societal traumatization, and cultural traumatization. First steps in recovering from traumatizing experience and post-traumatic response is identifying and naming trauma as trauma. Seeing, naming, and seeking to understand the harms we experience requires either tremendous courage or desperation. Treatment in mental health begins with acceptance. I always explain this to my patients, that the very first step in treatment is acceptance. You've got to accept that you have a problem and that you need solution, so that you can seek that solution and accept solution. Acceptance is very important. Just like the author said here, that the first steps is seeing, naming, and seeking to understand the harms we experience. Yes. And I agree with the opinion that this requires tremendous courage or desperation. Part 2, Constructing Trauma-Sensitive Theology. In Part 2, Constructing Trauma-Sensitive Theology, the author posits that when constructing a systematic trauma-sensitive theology, it is important to note that 1. Theology matters. Theology is not just the purview of some academics in a classroom. It is a fundamental activity of all of us, whether we directly recognize or acknowledge our personal theology or not. Number 2, theology, like many other disciplines, is a reflection of how human beings understand the world. 3, trauma-sensitive theology offered in this book is not intended to be definitive. Rather, it is one way of thinking through a variety of commitments and remains open. This implies that this work is not definitive. It is open to further research. It can be argued. We can remove from it or add to it, depending on our personal theology. Number 4, there is a shift in language and intent, which is a move from the modern and Enlightenment propositions towards ordered hierarchies of life. To be a theologian is to be on the boundary, to be a voice for the tradition, to speak for God, to defend God, to speak for one's fellow human beings, be in solidarity with one's fellow human beings before God, and speak the ought and have prior commitments. God's presence and enriching atonement. Jennifer spoke of God's divine presence and the theology of creation. She proceeded by looking at traumatic disruption, human power, and agency. Jennifer discussed sin, wounding, and the original offense. Jesus the Christ and restoring connection. This leads to a search for what saves. Jennifer concluded this part with a chapter on enriching atonement. Atonement is bringing into harmony. It is etymologically connected to attune as well as atone. Enriching atonement implies re-establishing connections to divine energy through self, offering those avenues of care to wounded and protective internal paths, and extending the grace of healthy relationality to others outside our embodied being in the journey towards a fulfilled, authentic, balanced, and harmonious life and world. When we attune or tune in to our emotional and spiritual lives and resources, a larger world of connection begins to unfold as we become more aware of divine presence in our life and in the lives of all living things. Conclusion. I want to say here that this presentation is not in depth. It is not an extensive or comprehensive representation of all the works of the author in this book. This is because I am working with time. I have only 15 minutes for this presentation. So what you have here is the summary of the author's intentions, her main goals and purpose for writing this book. I also present here the core concepts of the book and an overview of the two parts: seeing trauma and constructing trauma-sensitive theology. I recommend this book to everyone. Please endeavor to get a copy of Trauma-Sensitive Theology, Thinking Theologically in the Era of Trauma by Jennifer Baldwin. Conclusion, which is my overall takeaway from the book. Number one, trauma-sensitive theology affirmed the importance of theological thinking and practice for trauma survivors. It is a connection to their faith tradition, which can be a resource for stability and recovery. 2. Trauma-sensitive theology seeks to offer a theological balm for wounds of trauma and illuminate a path towards resiliency, healing, and restoration of connection and balance. 3. This effort endeavor to reduce abuses of theological, religious, or spiritual power that has potentials for further wounding survivors, and also offer theological language that fosters resiliency. 4. Theologians, clergy, and spiritual care providers, as arbiters and proclaimers of our religious traditions, rituals, and sacred texts, have active responsibility and role within the community of faith and in the world to update the way the central theme of faith is communicated. And lastly, trauma-sensitive theology recommends incorporating self-care with boundaries of care, with the ethical principle of non-maleficence, which is do not harm, and attuned care. Survivor's Creed by Jennifer Baldwin. I am a survivor. 1. I believe in survivors of trauma and in the promise of strength and resiliency. 2. I believe in God, divine energy and presence, who draws into order the waters of the deep. I believe in the Spirit, hovering in communion, present at the gift of creation, vivifying breath to the good and beloved human. 3. I believe in Jesus, the Christ, fully self-led and vision of optimal relationality, who experienced the full weight of trauma, disconnected from the source of life, resurrected, renewed, and offering the spirit of life. 4. I believe in the welcoming path, the honor of the body, the grace of companionship, the healing of wounds, the resurrection of the exiles, and the renewal of authentic life. Amen. My personal creed is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. It says, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body." My questions. Does the content of faith contribute to further traumatic wounding and overwhelming, or is it a resource for resiliency? My second question, how can this message be passed across to the church? If we agree that the church, or spirituality in general, can be a place of harm as well as a place of support and health, how do we pass this message across to churches, to the clergy and spiritual care professionals in such a way that they remain a place of health, fostering resiliency instead of wounding or harming survivors? This is a question I long for answers for. Thank you.